All right, today we're going to tie the missing link. This pattern is one that I've tied probably almost a decade ago, or initially 8 or 10 years ago, and it's been one of my most popular flies. I'm really proud of it because unlike a lot of nymphs, which you can kind of force feed to fish if you absolutely have to, with a dry fly, you bring the fish. The fish has to voluntarily come to this thing. It has to come to the surface to eat, which takes more effort than a nymph to start with. And then when he gets there, he's usually got a fairly long time to look at it. And so he's going to say yes or no. A large number of fish tend to say yes to this. And interestingly to me, it covers a lot of insect bases. When I originally tied it, I used it almost exclusively on a 16. And this is a 102Y hook, incidentally, which is this is a size 15. They come in off sizes. But when I used it, I'd use a 16 and I'd go places when there was a little Baetis hatches, little small 20s, 22s, and I'd use my 16, looked like a gunship come through them, and the fish would still eat them. And it's like, wow, I haven't seen that before. So there's something in it that engenders confidence. There's something about the profile and the way the fly sits in the water. Whatever it is, I don't pretend to know exactly what, but they just tend to really go for it. And remember, I tied it as a dead caddis imitation. That was what I tied it for initially. And so I've come to realize it does work for that, but it works for so much more. Almost all the insects, the mayflies, the caddis, the small stones, small ants and beetles even, they'll eat it for such a wide array of insects in such a wide array of situations, fast water, slow water, that it's just, I literally use this as my dry fly of choice. I can honestly say probably close to 80% of the time. It just works so well that I don't use parachute Adams anymore. I don't use elk hair Kess, the flies I used to use a lot. I just don't pull them out very much because this fly does it. And then so it's engendered confidence in me. And so I just know it's going to work. And so it kind of works both ways. But so as I mentioned, it's a Timco 102Y. I started tying this fly quite a few years ago, and that was a light wire dry fly hook that had a wide gap at that point. I still like it. I just the TMC 100 works perfectly well, and a lot of times I'll use that too. But the 102Y, as long as I'm not fishing for exceptionally large fish in very heavy current, is still probably my go-to. My home water is the lower Sac, and we are looking at very large fish in heavy water. So usually I'll use a 100 or even a 9300 sometimes, but usually a TMC 100 is perfect for that. But just for old time's sake, I'll tie this one on a 102Y. One thing that's fairly unusual, as you'll notice as I'm wrapping the initial base of thread wrap on this, is I'm bringing it all the way back almost to a midway point on the hook. If I was, when I first tied this, I was tying it, as I mentioned, as a dead caddis imitation, fishing in the lower Sacramento. And I thought, those things are so messed up and gobby looking when they're dead that, I want a lot of that fly to be sitting back in the water. So, I mean, I purposely tied it way back like that. As it turns out, in the years that came, I've come to believe that this kind of tying style has created a shuck. I think that fish see this more as a shuck than they do just as the end of a body sticking back there. And I've tied different things, again, tying by attrition, leaving parts out, or tying this fly so it starts, above the hook point bend and stuff. It just doesn't seem to work quite as well. And so I think it is kind of a shuck design, even though it was just kind of luck on my part. I wasn't trying to do that. So I'll take a single strand of pearl flashabou and wrap back over it, clear back to where I initially wrapped initially. Follow my thread back to that halfway point and then back up. So I'm trying to keep the body pretty uniform in size. No taper really, just trying to keep it about the same. Real thin, not much thicker than the hook shank. And I'll stop at about the midway point of the hook. As with all missing links, whether this or the honey ant or different variations, I try to keep a lot of open hook shank behind the eye because the last couple steps eat up a lot of hook shank. So try to keep the fly kind of far back. Now I'll tie this rib. And again, I've come to believe that this rib is really imitating a shuck, like a ribbed shuck, more than it is a ribbed nymph or, emerging nymph body, so to speak. It's actually the shuck part of that anyway. And the rib is pretty close. Just allow a little bit of brown thread to show through. So there is a striped effect. And then to keep it from blowing up on the first fish that eats it, I'll put a little UV on it. Bring it all the way back. Get enough on there, and you can use a bodkin to kind of even it out a little bit, take off any excess that needs coming off. Just the UV allows it not only to withstand a trout's teeth, but also gives it a little bit of a sheen, a little bit of a depth, which is kind of a neat effect, I think. I always like that. A lot of bugs do have sheen, whether it be trapped air bubbles or just slick little bodies. And so I do kind of like what this does. I initially used Softex for this. Softex works great. I really like it, but the fumes are horrific. And so I finally got tired of going to bed with headaches and said, you know what? I think that the UV products will work fine. And in fact, they do. The fish don't seem to care at all. Sometimes I know people have used epoxy. The problem with epoxy is that it's heavy, and sometimes it'll pull the back of that bug down too far. It'll want to pull the fly almost into straight up and down, which I don't want. So the thin coat of the UV usually seems about right. At this point, I'm going to use a little, what I call a wing splitter. And what it is it's a UV brown ice dub. And it's just a kind of a mixture with kind of a little UV fibers mixed in there that really give great highlights. When it gets wet, it looks very subdued, but it looks kind of like it has little lights within it, like inside lights that play out especially when it gets wet. And I want just enough of this so that when I tie my downwings in, it will keep them separated. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a moment. So just a nice little ball of dubbing, about that big. Too big and it looks weird. It just doesn't look right, and I want it, but too small, and it won't achieve its purpose of splitting my down wings. Now the down wings are light done Z-long, and a lot of times you'll pull off a hank of it like this, and you don't want to tie that in. That's way, way too much. I'm just gonna split that in half. Sometimes I even split it again, but there I've got maybe 10 fibers or so, 10, 12 fibers, and that's plenty. You do not want more than that. I could use 6 and it's going to work just fine. I'll use 10 or 12 because I like the way it looks. I'm going to tie that in right in front of that dubbing ball and wrap back over it so it butts right up against that dubbing ball. And when it does that, it'll want to kick out a little bit, almost like a spinner would, mayfly spinner wings would, out to the side. Now I'll go ahead and trim them to shape right now. I'll line up about with the bend of the hook. And I'll preen them down just a little bit so they'll kind of be out of the way the rest of the tying steps. But at this point, you can see it looks quite a bit like a mayfly spinner with the down wings to the side, just exactly the way I would tie a spinner in many cases. And I think that one of the beauties of the missing link is its ability to mimic a lot of different things. Could be a mayfly done emerging, could be a spinner, could be it could be a spent and dying sinking mayfly. It could be a lot of different things. Same thing with caddis. It was initially tied as a caddis, but I quickly realized it's maybe even a better mayfly than it is a caddis. Also does well for little yellow stones, small stoneflies, beetles, ants, stuff like that. Just a lot of things that eat it. Now for the upwing, I'm going to bring my thread up a little bit, still not coming all the way to the eye, but bring it up and back, just creating a little solid thread foundation. Because when I tie on the elk, I don't want it to spin on my hook. So a thread foundation will really help keep that from happening. I really like cow elk. Cow elk is very hollow, very blunt. The tips are very blunt, almost no little black tips at all. Black tips to me, they're kind of useless. They stick out and create length without any benefit. They're skinny little things that don't float well. So with the really blunt cow elk tips, they're useful right to the tip. They're blunt, they're hollow, they help float a fly really, really well. And I like that golden hue that they have too. It's a really nice hair. Again, that's cow elk. Clip it off the hide, and then of course have to get the little underfur out so it'll stack well. Just kind of preen that out a little bit. And ready for the stacker. A few taps. And we've got our stacked hair ready to be pulled out. And at this point, you can kind of see, maybe I've got a little bit too much hair, it won't tie down well. I'll remove some of it just to get the right bulk and density. And at this point too, I'll measure the distance. And I want it just about the length of the hook shank. Is about what I want here. Measure it, switch hands. I'm going to tie it down. Start tying it down behind, right midway between the eye and the dubbing ball, and then wrap back over it, back to the dubbing ball. And it's a lot of thread. And people say, well, why do you have so much thread? It's odd on a dry fly. But actually, you'll see when we tie it, the stacked hair to the back and the unstacked hair to the front are going to pull up, and they're going to have a multifunctional purpose that I'll explain when we get there. But at this point, we've got the stacked hair, and we've got the non-stacked hair. The unstacked hair, I'm going to lift up, post up underneath it a little bit, just to kind of try to get it to one nice clump of hair. And then I'm going to choose my hackle. And for the hackle, I use different colors and things for different flies. For the traditional missing link, I'll usually use a dun hackle. Dark dun usually, light dun's okay. But I do like the dun. It's interesting. Before the missing link, I almost never used dun hackle. It's just odd. I can't even remember why I used it exactly. But I started, and it's just one of those just serendipitous things where I've tried other hackles colors since on the original dark brown color, and none seem to work quite as well. Fish do like this dun color, so it made me a believer in dun where I'd never used it before. Sometimes in fly tying, I find that intuitiveness plays a bigger role than just smart thinking. Sometimes we can't really know. We make fortuitous choices that we don't really know why, but we do, and then we find out, hey, that really worked well. I wonder why. And we may never know why, but I think there's a lot to fly tying more than just getting everything exactly perfectly correct in our minds, because there's so much we can't know in fly tying that, my whole thing is, what do the fish see? But how do we know exactly how fish see? We have some idea, but not always perfect. So I'm going to wrap the hackle around everything, both the stacked and the non-stacked hair. Wrap around several times. Capture it. Tie it off on the hook. And you can see that even though I left a lot of hook shank open, so I was tying this, it came pretty close to the eye. So you do have to be careful when you do that. And tie the fly. Make sure you leave plenty of space there. And a little bit of extra. Cut off. A bit of a whip finish. And then the final step is to pull those unstacked hairs forward. Okay. Good tension on them so they're all together. Reach in with the tips of the scissors. Cut those fairly short. And so getting back to why I have the thread between the two clumps of hairs, when you do this, when you have a little bit of space between them, it forces, when you tie the hackle in, the hackle forces the blunt ends and the stacked ends to come almost straight up together. And so it really helps. It gives a high wing profile. So the angler can see that wing profile really well in the water. If you kick it straight down, almost like an elk or caddis, much more difficult to see on the water. Plus, a lot of bugs, when they hatch, are gonna, this fly will kind of sit butt down in the water, almost, like a modified clinghammer, nothing that dramatic, but the back end is gonna sink in the water, and got a few more stray hairs there. And it's going to give you just that those wings are going to remain visible. And if you want to skate this fly, the little short blunt tips up front will help you skate the fly in the water. Very often in lower Sacramento, where I fish, we'll find fish skiing on caddis that have hatched and are skating to the bank. So we'll cast this missing link out, skate it up, drop it, skate it up, drop it. and it'll skate for a very frail looking flight, skates very well, and the fish just annihilate it. Most of the time I'm dead drifting it, but so you've got the what I have come to believe is the shuck, the thread body, and the shiny rib. You've got a wing splitter underneath of the UV brown dubbing, the wings that you split, which are the light dun Zelon yarn, upwing of the cow elk, and a nice dark dun hackle, parachute style. That's the missing link. If I had one dry fly to fish, no question, that's going to be the one.